Jerry Ashton here again with another Occupy Focus interview here on WGRNradio.com's program 15 Minutes of Fact. And again, finding myself in the company of a true veteran of the wars, Robert Lederman. His may not be a household name here in New York City or in the Occupied movement, but if we care at all for the exercise of our civil liberties, it should be. Long before a single Zuccotti protester waving a cardboard sign decorated with protest art was ever arrested, Robert Lederman has been there, and he had done that. Long before Mayor Bloomberg's Boys in Blue crackdown on the sidewalk art of the Occupier, Robert Lederman had poked at Mayor Giuliani and the illegal acts of New York's finest way back in the day. So Robert was the subject, or is the subject, of a Huffington Post blog that I wrote just this past week, which seemed to get a lot of attention, mainly because of who he is and what he does. Robert is president of ARTIST. That's the Street Artists' Rights Advocacy Group here in New York City. He's a painter, printmaker, musician, video artist, and as far as the city and parks of New York City goes, he's a troublemaker, which makes us proud to have him on 15 Minutes of Fact. So welcome to the show today, Robert.
Thanks, Jerry. Very good to be a guest on your show.
Well, watching the Occupy people engage in legal struggles with the city administration and the police department must really be deja vu for you. Up to this point, you've won 5 federal lawsuits about speech in public spaces, including on this being on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and being detained for acting out of something called free speech rights. But you won that lawsuit, and your political art has won a lot of awards too, in the way that it satirizes Giuliani and, of course, most recently Mike Bloomberg. So there are so many things to discuss with you as both a protester, an artist, a civil rights advocate, someone who stands up against power. So why don't we start first with the most recent thing that you've been involved in, and then we'll go to the Occupy group.
Okay, well, the most recent thing is my lawsuit against the Parks Department and Mayor Bloomberg. In 2010, they passed a new set of park rules for what they call expressive matter vendors, which are visual artists who are selling paintings, prints, photographs, and sculptures. And these restrictions are very severe. They basically resulted in a 98% ban of all artists from all the parks in New York City. At the same time, they were still allowing performers to perform in the parks. And then they reversed that position and began summoning all the performers. And then when there were some protests by the community and the performers, they backed off on that and announced that they weren't going to be summoning the performers. And then just yesterday, in the latest legal motions in my lawsuit, they submitted documents which reversed their position again and claim that that laying off the performers is only temporary, that they have every intention to go back in the parks and summons or arrest as many performers as they could find.
One would think with even the modest level of crime, and I use that with tongue in cheek, that's here in New York City, there has to be a better use of the police, and our so-called police. I call them the cardboard cops because they're always chasing down cardboard artists. And there must be something better for them to do. Why do they have a vendetta against artists, and why do they have a vendetta against performers?
Well, the issue is not the police. The issue is the mayor, the business improvement districts, and the park conservancies. Under Mayor Bloomberg, all of our city parks have been turned over to private corporate interests, most of which are real estate interests, and they manage the parks on behalf of the city. The parks are still public, but each of these park conservancies are private corporations that have a tremendous amount of power over each of the parks and what happens in them. And the police view themselves, rightly or wrongly, as actually working for these business improvement districts and park conservancies rather than for the public. And in fact, these park conservancies and business improvement districts actually, in many cases, pay the salaries of the police, buy their vehicles, pay for their uniforms, pay for their guns, in some cases pay for their precinct house to be built, for their radio equipment, and in some cases these conservancies and business improvement districts have their own private police forces located inside the NYPD precincts as if they're simply another branch of the police.
Now, I think I have to stop there and elaborate on that, or have you elaborate on it, because what we're seeing then is not only the militarization of the police for crackdowns and what have you on Occupy Wall Street protesters and anybody else who raises their head above the foxhole, but we have a private police force which is not even accountable to, presumably not even accountable to the citizens, because they're really working for the conservancies. Explain that.
Well, if you take what happened in Zuccotti Park, I think anybody that is from New York and is familiar with the police, as I am, was amazed at the ferocity of the response of the police to those protesters, most of whom were totally law-abiding, and the police were acting as if they were dealing with armed terrorists. What the public didn't understand and what the media didn't bother to tell them is that the Downtown Alliance Business Improvement District, which is the private corporation that's in charge of the streets down by Zuccotti Park, has the closest imaginable relationship to the NYPD. They actually built the police precinct. They pay for their cars. They pay for a lot of their uniforms. When the commanders, let's say a captain of the precinct, retires, he goes to work as a private security guard for the business improvement district. So those police that were down there, they weren't even really expressing an NYPD policy. They were expressing the policy of a private corporate interest, the Downtown Alliance Business Improvement District, which, by the way, was founded by David Rockefeller.
You know what I find as an interesting parallel, back in the day of the strikes when Pinkerton, that famous private army of so-called detectives, were hired by corporations, and they were the ones who set upon strikers, and they were the ones who shot and killed strikers back in those days, and yet they were presumably simpatico with the police techniques at that time. Is that anything similar happening now?
Well, it's certainly very similar, but the difference is that these NYPD officers are sworn to uphold the Constitution. It's one of the basic things they have to do as they become a cop, whereas a Pinkerton officer obviously isn't. He's totally a private security guard. So the violation of civil liberties that went on in that protest, and that continues to go on today in Union Square Park, it's really a striking abandonment of civil liberties by the police, who are supposedly the people protecting our civil liberties.
Well, you were referred to me for this interview and for my Huffington Post blog by another artist protester who has recently been the subject of police harassment and ticketing, David Everett Carlson. What do you know of him, and how does his plight resemble some of your earlier and ongoing fights with the city?
Well, David and the other protesters in Union Square Park, somewhat without realizing it, stumbled into the ground zero of the privatization fight in terms of the public space, the streets, and artists. We're in the midst of this long-running lawsuit about the parks. Union Square Park is actually the center point of that lawsuit. And myself, as the lead plaintiff, many of the activities that I do that I get arrested for involve displaying paintings and signs on cardboard in places like Union Square Park. So what David is experiencing is sort of a microcosm of this larger privatization street artist war that the city's been involved in for over 20 years now.
Well, you have been nothing less than diligent in the way that you've been attacking this problem. Probably it's all too many cases a lone voice, but I know that you have a Yahoo group called NYC Street Artists, which I visited. It's well worth visiting. In one location, a reader can find files on media clips, bid information, court rulings, lawsuits, and photos of your going on 250 protests right now. What do you recommend about that site, and can anybody join it?
Anybody can join it. It's, as you described, it has virtually everything you might need to know if you plan to be a street artist. And frankly, a lot of the information is equally valid if you're a protester. One of the things that I discovered over the course of these 20 years of activism is that most people, including most police, really don't understand what the laws are that govern protests or free speech, and that if you arm yourself with accurate information about what your rights are, it puts you in a much better position when you're dealing with the police. And I've used it a lot. It's protected me quite a bit, even though I have been arrested falsely 44 times and gotten almost 100 summonses. I was able to beat all the summonses and all the arrests, and I was able to successfully sue the city. And a large part of that success is due to the fact that I first studied what the laws on something like disorderly conduct are, so that I would know where the line really is. If you depend on the local police officer that you're standing in front of to tell you what that law is, you're going to basically get misinformation or outright disinformation.
Well, you became an early thorn in the side of Bloomberg when you had the gall to go to one of his pet projects, which is the High Line. And you were there a couple of years back at the West 14th Street section of the High Line, where just for standing there and attempting to sell your art, you were issued 5 summonses, 2 of which were criminal, and that included that disorderly conduct and failure to comply with directions of officers. And then, of course, you also did not have a park permit. You failed to have your display comply with the required permits and authorized vending. It is absurd, the schemes by which presumed laws are used to stop people from their rightful place and their rightful voice. So what happened in that particular case with the High Line?
Well, there's one detail that you omitted, and it's the most significant one, which is that in 2001, I won a federal lawsuit, went all the way to the appeals court, that said that artists don't need a permit to sell in any park. So in fact, when I was arrested 2 times on the High Line, I was totally legal. I had a legal display, I was in a legal location, and I'd already won a lawsuit that said I could sell there. The park commissioner himself personally ordered those arrests, and subsequently, after I made a lawsuit about it, he had to apologize for me as well as settling the case. So the extent of illegality that was involved in that, it wasn't some theoretical right that I was expressing. It had already been established by a federal court order that I or any artist could sell on the High Line.
Well, do we have a case of whack-a-mole here, that every time you pound down one illegal use of police force, one illegal use of police and park restrictions, and then damned if another one doesn't pop up?
Well, that's a good way to describe it. But people need to understand that this is not a matter of city officials just randomly having nothing to do and deciding to go after me or other artists. They have a very specific agenda behind all of this. It's all about privatization of public property and then turning that public property into a cash-generating system for corporations that are closely associated with Mayor Bloomberg. He's the biggest privatizer there's ever been in this country. He's basically turned over all the parks to real estate corporations, and he's in the process actually of turning over the streets to these corporations. A couple of years ago, he actually tried to privatize the roads, the bridges, and the highways in New York City. So he has a very specific agenda about this, and street artists in general, and myself in particular, are pebbles in his shoe that's somehow preventing them from completing this privatization agenda to the way that they want to do it.
Which I might say also is the effect that Occupy is having on them, because just this last weekend, I won't advertise their name, but a major corporation basically took over Union Square to have a promotional event, which I'm sure they paid the city for, and the protesters and everybody else were promptly swept away.
That's it in a nutshell. In fact, Union Square Park has a corporate promotion virtually every day of the year. The cost for each of those promotions is anywhere from $10,000 to a couple of $1 million. They take over often the entire park. And again, this is a public park. I'm not against the corporation having some opportunity in a park, but when you close the park to the public, turn it over to a corporation, and eliminate all the First Amendment activities, artists, performers, political activists, so that somebody can advertise baloney or bank discounts or hair supplies, it's a complete violation of the entire purpose of public parks.
Well, 15 minutes of fact is hardly sufficient to be able to encompass what you are all about and how important you are and the street artist groups are for protecting everybody's First Amendment rights and rights of assembly. So I'm going to bring this particular interview to a close, Robert. Is there anything, one word or thought you'd like to leave with us?
Well, I'll say this. My own personal experience about the First Amendment was that until I was in my 40s, I had the vaguest idea what it was or the value of it to me. I only began to appreciate it when the Mayor Giuliani, began to have me arrested and confiscate my art and destroy my rights. And as a result, I became very inspired about the First Amendment, and I see it as the most important thing that stands between freedom and tyranny. And it keeps us from having to resort to violence, to have the right to peacefully protest or hold up a protest sign. So everybody should exercise that First Amendment right as frequently as they can.
Well, amen. And Robert, you can be reached, of our people interested in learning more about you or seeking assistance from you, or maybe wanting to help you, you can be reached at your email, which is artistpres, ARTISTPRES, @gmail.com. You're also on Twitter as @artistpres, on YouTube as NYC Street Artist Videos, and of course to visit the artist website, which by the way stands for Artists Response to Illegal State Tactics, which was founded in 1993. You can go to their website in groups Yahoo, NYC Street Artists. And this is Jerry Ashton. Once again, pleased to be able to be reporting on what's really happening in Occupy Wall Street, what's really happening in the world of protests, as opposed to the 15 minutes of faux that unfortunately we get from mainstream media. Signing off till the next time, Jerry Ashton, WGRNradio.com, 15 minutes of fact.